Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Lazarevic. I am a developer advocate at Gravity, and I would like to talk to you about Design First. So, let's start off with the rise of APIs. And I'm sure many of you have spotted that we're going through this big proliferation of APIs. So gone are the days of many years ago where maybe you'd have a few APIs to a system, organization had a few to manage. And we're now switching into this place where a typical organization is looking at tens, hundreds, thousands, plus many APIs that they're looking and managing. And there's a number of reasons why we're seeing this big explosion of APIs. And this is not a definitive list, but there's lots and lots of things, and we can look at some of those. So one, that popular phrase, breaking up the monolith, and there is a talk afterwards talking about exactly how to approach that problem. But if you think about how historically we'd have these big applications, and there you'd have lots of different services that are available to use, and moving through these trends, so things such as service-oriented architectures, microservices, or just generally recognizing that it's probably better to not have so much dependency in one application. We're starting to see how some of these services are being split apart, and there's lots of different reasons for that. We're looking towards event-driven architectures, so that means we're starting to think about asynchronous connections, so that in its turn, naturally, we're splitting things apart. It makes it a lot easier. If we can start splitting out obvious functions from each other, then we can have separate teams looking after them, better maintenance, less dependencies, decoupling, all of those benefits and many, many more. Another big reason is faster innovation. So as we're moving more towards product-driven APIs, so we're starting to look at APIs as ways of getting data for various things we're looking to work with. Companies can start to build out POCs, so for example, proof of concept. So for example, let's say you are a taxi booking service. Maybe you want to get a Google Maps API, which they're going to charge you for each time you make a call to go away and find out information about where somebody's requesting a ride or where your drivers might be. Maybe you buy a subscription to a weather data API where you can get information about if it's going to start raining, and therefore maybe you start introducing surge charging and so forth. So the idea is that the company can start to bring all of these different things together. They can test out a concept, see if it works, and very quickly iterate through and design things. And then bringing these things together, this idea of sharing resources is another big one. So let's take data as an example. So you sort of think about where typically a large organization might have some kind of a centralized data structure, so like some sort of business intelligence. They've got this big enterprise data warehouse or some sort of data lake. And if you're a department and you've got some interesting data, what do? Well, the centralized data organization will go, hey, that data looks amazing. By the way, it's probably going to take a couple of months for us to go away and figure out how exactly we're going to sort of integrate that in. And then you've got another department going, hey, that data looks amazing. Can we get that data? And then you have that other process, which then goes through where you've tried to sort of shoehorn your data model onto this centralized data model, and then you go away and make a request of data. And now we're in this situation where you've got each department, each area within the business. They've got the data knowledge, that domain knowledge. They've got the specialized models. And they can go, hey, Department B, you would like that data? Not a problem. And they can start thinking about doing things like putting APIs in front of slices of data and sharing it. So you're getting this nice democratization of data across your organization. And there's lots of other reasons why we're seeing an explosion of APIs. And these are just some of them. And with that rise of the number of APIs that we're seeing, we are also seeing this rise of API First. And last year, Postman had their State of the API report. And of the 28,000 respondents to their survey, 2/3 of them said that they were either somewhat API First or they were fully API First. So when we say API First, what exactly do we mean? Do we mean we're developing APIs before the applications and the integrations? Are we saying, actually, we are defining and designing APIs before development? What do we mean? I think it's better to think about API first as a mindset, a way of thinking. And what we're basically saying is we want to treat APIs as first-class citizens. So what do I mean by this? If we think about historically, how would you go about development? You would build a big application of some description. Great, so we've gone off, we've built this, it's got all the functionality and things that we want. And then we're left with that question of, OK, how are we going to go away and now get this application, this system, to be able to talk to other things? And then you have the challenge there where you're going to go away, you build your API after you've built this application, and then you're going to be stuck with maybe some hooks with regards to what technology choices you've made or what terminology that you use. And what we're saying is that actually, if we think about now, everything in the project that you're working on will ultimately use APIs, either internally to different services that are talking to each other. It could be business units that are calling your APIs. It could be your external consumers. Regardless of how you look at it, everything within that project will ultimately use APIs. They are the doorway to your services and functions that you're offering. And as we're thinking about this, maybe what we should be doing is developing our APIs ahead of any other components. So if we're looking to build some kind of web application, mobile app, let's think about those APIs first, develop those ahead of all the other components, and then continue with the rest of the project. And this brings in a number of advantages. So first one, we start thinking about reusability. Because we're starting to focus our thinking about what is this API helping do? What business problem is this solving? What pain is this going to resolve? What data is this going to provide from a higher context? It's going to start introducing this idea of reusability. So you have a well-defined, well-designed API for your services. You don't have this situation where you go, well, this one kind of 50% covers it, so let's go build another one. You're trying to remove that and encouraging the reusability of components. It encourages stakeholder collaboration, because for you to understand what exactly this API needs to do, you need to go and talk to all of your key stakeholders, and they could be your product owners, your business analysts, maybe people within the business themselves, potentially even the customers who are going to be consuming this if they're external to your organization, and of course your internal customers. And also, because we're doing this thinking ahead of time and we're thinking about what problems are we trying to solve, we are looking at opportunities to lower app development cost, because we're going to solve any problems that we might have, thinking ahead of time, so that when we actually get to the building stage, we're less likely to have to rewrite big chunks of code. So this talks about design first. And design first is not always API first. So API first is not always design first. So let's have a look at a couple of different approaches. So the first one is code first, and something to highlight quickly here. So this is a methodology, a process, rather than a set in stone thing. So we've got one approach, which is code first, and we have a number of stages. So our first stage is to get the business input. So this is where we get all of the stakeholders together. So we get them sat around the table, and this is going to be our domain experts. So people in the business who understand what feature, what thing this API is trying to do, as well as our technology stakeholders, so our developers, our architects, those people involved. Maybe we're also going to speak to customers as well to come in and provide their input. So we go away, we get all of that input, we get that understanding, we do our brainstorming, our sessions, all that's required. We capture all of that information, and then that is taken away, this input, and we go and build our API. And then once we've built our API, we can then go away and create some documentation. So maybe we generate the documentation off the back of our code. So maybe we've got some annotations in there and the various supporting libraries that we have for that. Maybe we go off and write it. Maybe we've got some kind of hybrid approach where we bring those two together. Now, In a design-first approach, when we look at API first, we have that same stage at the start, that business input. So this is where we get all of the stakeholders involved to talk about what the requirements of this API is required. And then we put together our API design. We will design our schema. So design first may also be referred to as schema first. And this is where we then go away and create our API contract. And then once we've got our API contract, then we go away and build our API. So let's go into a little bit more detail here if we think about the design first life cycle. So there we go. We've got our design and discuss stage. So this is where we're going away. We're talking about what we're looking to do about this API. We've got the stakeholders. We're getting the input. We're feeding it back. Maybe we're looking potentially at some wireframes. And then once all of that's agreed, we then approve our API schema or API model. And what we can do, because during that design and discuss stage, we were also collecting information about things like, well, what naming conventions should we use? We've been collecting information as, well, let's give an example of what this data would look like. What would the output look like when somebody makes a request? What does a request look like? And all of this can be put into your API schema, depending what you use, and we're going to talk through a couple of standards. You can then use that API schema that you've created and use that to now go away and generate your API documentation. You can use the examples that you've specified in your schema to generate mocks that you can host. You can also use that to create code stubs and client SDKs. And what this means is that as a front-end developer, you can go refer to the API documentation. You can go off and use some hosted mocks. Mocks, if those have been examples, where you can go away and start, for example, if you're building some kind of a front end, to call those mocks and get some sample data back to see what that looks like. You've got client SDKs to help you quickly speed up what you're building. The back-end developer, again, has an agreed API documentation, so they know exactly what they're building for. You've got code stubs to help build that approach. And then we've got the automated testing side as well, where because you've got an idea of what this, you know what this spec is, you've got some examples, you can start building that process in as well for both the back-end and front-end development side. An interesting thing here is that those processes are happening before a single line of code for the API was written. So some of the benefits of using this approach: improved communication. Because we're getting everybody in from the get-go, because we're thinking this sort of like API is a product, API is the doorway to our project, we're getting everybody involved who needs to be involved right from the get-go. And this means that we're going to have this nice rapid feedback loop from business and customers, and our technical developers as well. So we're starting to think about what's involved with all of this. Do we have issues? Is there going to be an issue from a business perspective? Is there going to be an issue from an implementation perspective? So we've got this nice loop back that we can keep going through, and we can use wireframes if need be. What are the right approaches? And it helps fit in with this idea of product-driven APIs, which is the trend. So this idea of what purpose are we trying to solve here? What pain is this solving? This is the doorway to the service that we're going to be providing. And it provides that better developer experience. So the fact that before we start developing, we've got our API documentation, we've got test data we can work against, we can host that, we can start thinking about like improvement around any kind of feedback iterations. And that in turn helps drive that parallel development. So rather than the other teams waiting for the API to be built before they go and start building any front-end applications or that kind of thing, you can have all of the developers working in parallel once the API contract has been agreed. And we can enforce governance and security. So if we've got some rules around what our models are supposed to look like, if we've got some defined language that we should be using, if we've got some thoughts around what security we should be thinking about, such as any kind of authorization or any kind of access to the API, we can start thinking about how that applies. And I'm just going to give you an example of some tooling that maybe you can use to help with this, and there's many tools. I've just grabbed a few of them. So you've got an example here. So this is Swagger Hub. So here, for example, you can imagine you've worked with all the stakeholders, you've got an agree of all the designs that all the requirements that you want and what the design needs to look like. You've done all the work, whether it's on paper, bits of paper, whether you're using some modeling tools, you've done your collaboration, and you can start sort of sketching it out here. And what Swagger Hub will allow you to do is you can start doing things like generating documentation off the back of the schema that you're building. It will allow you to host some mocks so that developers can start calling them and getting an idea of what that sort of engagement with the API is going to look like, and so forth. And you can do things like enforce naming standards, and if you've got naming conventions that you're using across your set of APIs, you can use that as a repository and pull them back in. So that's one example, and that's using OpenAPI, which is one of the common specifications for REST. Another example is maybe you want to go something a bit more visual. So this is API Designer. So here, this is an example of where you've got a click and drag tool where you can start defining, what your resource is going to look like, what properties, what attributes you're going to have. You can start putting in example data there. And this is a great one where if you've got more non-technical stakeholders, if you want to get them engaged and start talking about what's going on, you can start doing that. And then with this, you can either generate your OpenAPI specification, or you can go away and publish this into an API gateway. And again, you can start using those that generate mocks based off of the example data that you've provided, documentation, you get feedback like that. Got another tool here. So this is Async API Studio. So Async API is a specification for asynchronous APIs. So think if you're working with things like Kafka and RabbitMQ and so forth. And again, so this is a text-based one again. And again, as you're working through and you're building out your specification, the Studio will do things such as validate your schema. It will provide visualizations for any of your event flows. You can preview documentation, that kind of thing. So you start to get a flow of this. And again, there are many tools that can help you to do this and help with that sort of wireframing effort. And just making sure that you've got it quite right before you start coding your API. And I just want to quickly touch on a little bit on API management as well, because I feel that when you're talking about design first, and especially when you're talking about having many APIs, that API management is a really useful methodology for helping you think about aspects that aren't necessarily core business logic when it comes to your APIs. So you've got the Wikipedia definition up there. I'm not going to read it out, but very quickly, what API management does is it's basically that methodology, that thinking behind the life cycle of your API, from creating it to publishing it to deprecating it. And it allows us to think about things such as how do you manage how people are using your API, both from a business perspective. So if you're monetizing your API and you want to manage how often somebody can access it based on a subscription tier, to just looking after how it's accessed from a protecting your backends perspective, so preventing somebody from hitting your API too many times. Managing your identity and access management. So how are people accessing your API? Are they authorized? Have they been authenticated? Looking after how developers are using the APIs. So how do they know to discover what's available? Where do they find the documentation? How do they provide feedback? And ultimately, understanding how your APIs are being used. Are they being used? Are they healthy? And maybe try to detect some malicious things going on. And the reason why I'm talking about API management very quickly in the context of API design is that if we think about the anatomy of an API, we've got lots of things going on. And whilst some of these elements that go around the API, so if we think about the API in the middle, that's like our core business logic that it's serving, or it's going to be, providing the input and the output that we're expecting from our services. We've got all of these different things that go around the concern. So things around maybe like security or monitoring, and definitely things around protocol mediation. So like if we're going from a REST to a Kafka stream or something like that. So all of these things aren't necessarily going to be key business concerns when you're thinking about design first and what purpose does this API need to serve. But something like API management can say, well, actually, you know what? A lot of this stuff we can handle. There's a lot of out-of-the-box platforms that can manage this for you. So don't worry about that. Let API management handle that. That's something that we can put to one side and think about. And then you worry about the core focus of what that API is supposed to do. And again, this is very common if you look at things such as microservices as well, where you've got sidecars that deal with the actual, the things about how these things are going to communicate with each other or how you're going to authenticate them. And you just focus about that business logic within the API itself. So, okay, I've been talking about API first and design first a lot, and this is a DDD conference. So I'm hoping a lot of you have gone, actually, a lot of this stuff sounds quite familiar, right? So we've got this big stakeholder input, including wanting to understand the domain that we're working in. So we're trying to think about this from a top-down approach. So rather than thinking about how do we go from the application and kind of like glue all these things together, we're thinking about, well, what problems, what thing is the business trying to solve? This is the purpose of this API, and work downwards and get all of that relevant stakeholder knowledge. Governance, we want to try and think about what kind of language we're using. We want to start thinking about how this is being accessed and and security and that kind of thing. And we're thinking about ultimately business alignment. How does this fit in with different things? So I think that design first fits in really well with domain-driven design, because if we think about all of the approaches that we go through with regards to thinking about what are the domains, what are the subdomains, we're thinking about where do we want to focus our effort on understanding what we're building versus what we're going to bring in and buy and that kind of thing, that effectively we can start twisting slightly how we use design first, and we can say, well, okay, we've already understood a bit of the logic, so we can start to think about when we're splitting out APIs where they fit and then continue that conversation down. It's encouraging that collaboration with technical experts. So we have to have technical experts there as well as the domain experts. And again, that's something what API first and design first really push for, which is making sure you get all of that relevant stakeholder knowledge and experience in there to make sure that you're building something that is fit for purpose. And again, it's encouraging that common language based on the models being used. So again, that's something that can come in from that governance piece when we're doing design first to make sure that we are using the right appropriate language for each API that we design. So wrapping up, got the benefits of design first, so improving stakeholder communication, and we get rapid feedback from that so that we make sure that the effort that we're investing is right and we're building the right thing, that it can support governance and security, especially if we bring API management into the picture there as well. And it can provide a better developer experience just because we know ahead of time, before we write a single line of code, what it's supposed to look like, what the documentation is, and can we test it out, as well as encouraging parallel development and the benefits that that brings with regards to the speed of project delivery and costs. And again, I believe that design first fits in nicely with domain-driven design because, again, those key principles of encouraging collaboration with your stakeholders, supporting the use of a common language, and that top-down thinking, so focus on the domain, not the application. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You've got my contact details here as well. And otherwise, I hope you have a fabulous rest of conference.